Hi, Misha here, and this is the Ithaca, or Ithaca if you prefer, and Inland, which there's a story there why I say it like that, Model 37 trench gun, 12 gauge. I hesitate to call it a replica, although some might. I like to think of it as kind of like a reissue, like the Colts, because it is made in part by Ithaca, part by Inland. And that's actually the story about how this was one of the guns the ATF got cranky with me on my books with. I'll tell the story. But also just wanted to go out and run a few rounds through it. This is 12 gauge. Unlike the ones made in the 60s, this one will shoot not just 2 3/4, but also 3-inch magnums. So that's kind of nice. Go through the features. I always like the system here with these. Nice laid out controls. There's just something about the Ithaca system. Of course, its roots do go back to John Moses Browning, so what do you expect? So before we run a few shells through, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help us out, check out Patreon. Ithaca. She works.
Good.
So, here on the swing. The reason I'm doing these, it kind of saves my camera person's time, and these are mostly just story times anyway. And we'll begin with, of course, the background of this. As I said, this has its roots with JMB. Really right before the First World War, along with another John, in this case Pedersen, which we've done videos on, they designed a bottom loading and feeding shotgun, which eventually would go into production at Remington is the M17, and would be a moderate success, but it was in 20 gauge, so it was never a military type gun. Then Henry Howland would improve it in the early 1930s, especially making it lighter, simpler, and safer, frankly. This would be after, of course, Browning was passed away. But he couldn't put it in production. He was working with Ithaca until 1937, when the patent had run out on the 17. Now, Remington had actually already replaced the M17 with the M31, but again, patents were in place. So, yeah, in 1937, the M37, Ithaca Model 37, was introduced as a sporting trap type gun, but it wasn't 12 gauge, although in the next couple of years you will see a 16 gauge and a 20 gauge version. Now these are all, again, sporter commercial guns. So where'd the trench gun come from? Well, 1940-41, the U.S. Ordnance Department, U.S. government, kind of standardized on half a dozen approved trench guns. Basically, as long as it could mount a bayonet and fire 12 gauge, they were cool with it. You would have a couple of Savages on the list. You had the 530 and the 620. And you had a couple of Winchesters, the 1897 and the 1912, which we've done a video on, original. You had the Remington M31, and you had the Ithaca, which was quite new in production at the time, M37. Now, of course, the U.S. would not join World War II until December of 1941, but in November of that year, even prior to Pearl Harbor, the U.S. put an order in with Winchester for new trench guns. They hadn't really ordered any numbers since World War I. This inspired Ithaca to kind of tinker their design with features in case of a government contract. They would go to the kind of 20-inch cylinder bore, bead sight. Of course, they'd have what the U.S. government called a handguard, sling mounts, all that good stuff. And it's a good thing they did for them, because around March of 1942, they would get an order for 1,400 so-called riot style with bayonet mount, yada yada, government talk. And these would be primarily delivered that summer. And the early ones would have the fish and game scene on the side, at least they could. Some of them could also have the checkered stocks. But very soon into production, they would go to the slab side receiver and the just oiled stocks. Now, these were originally blued. The World War II contract M37 trench guns, but of course during refurbishment and all that, they would get phosphated, they get parkerized. But they wouldn't last long. The final ones were delivered in September of that year, bringing the total to 1,422. And towards the end of 1942, Ithaca and the U.S. Ordnance Department would jointly decide that, Ithaca's time, energy, efforts would be better spent on making 1911 A1s. Winchester kind of had the shotgun thing logged down. So, yeah. And this was because of a change-up in 1911 A1 production that actually gets into the whole Singer story, which we've also talked about in other videos. Kind of getting there at this point. So these would be the only true trench guns made by Ithaca in World War II. It's very, very unlikely that they actually saw service in the Pacific. It's probably just guard duty stateside training. Now, Ithaca would also deliver about 4,500 other shotguns. 18-inch barrel, maybe 20-inch without the heat shield, or even longer barrel for sport shooting and all that on military bases. So all told, let's say they provided about 6,000 shotguns to the U.S. during World War II. But that's all they needed. Like a lot of stuff after the war, the government had more than enough small arms, and this would continue through 1950 in Korea, and therefore the U.S. would not order any new shotguns for that war. However, once the conflicts in Southeast Asia started ramping up in the early 1960s, that would change. The markings are quite neat on this. We have the barrel markings here, and we have the RLB inspector stamp, and we have the ordnance palm, and we have the Inland Manufacturing, which is admittedly my bad, but was also my mistake, because I actually got this directly from Ithaca Co., and that's what kind of led to the issue with the ATF. Let me tell you the story. So the story about how this got me into trouble. One of the first manufacturers that gave me any kind of credibility, even would talk to me when I first became an FFL 15 years ago, was the new Ithaca company in Upper Sandusky, Ohio. Something that I'm actually greatly appreciative to. In fact, they sent me a Christmas card in 2010. I know it was just it was good PR though. And so when these trench gun replicas came out in 2016, and I knew that the parts were made, at least most of them, by Ithaca, I got it, ordered them, couple in, and I put the manufacturer down as Ithaca. In our books, we had to put a manufacturer. Yeah, the receiver says Inland. Of course, I'm blind. I didn't know that. So, oops. Inland started a few years later, about 2013, mostly making M1 carbines, which we've done videos on, and probably need to do an update on that too, and 1911s, and they kind of partnered with Ithaca. They're both in Ohio. In fact, the new Inland, which is, just taking the name over, is really close to the old Inland, which is part of GM Motors in Dayton, Ohio. So they partnered together in 2016, and I went back in my books and looked, and yeah, it was 2016 when I logged the first few of these in. But yeah, because of the way that things are with the ATF and how strict they are about bookkeeping now, they almost have to find something wrong. And the thing they found wrong was, I had this logged in, is Ithaca is the manufacturer, not Inland. Oops. But they were cool about it. They basically just said, hey, you need to make a correction to your books. There's a way to do that. They filed it as a, minor mistake, infraction, whatever. I made the correction. They signed off on it. I signed documents. That was that. Yeah, in situations like that, when it's just an honest human error, they can be flexible. But I wouldn't put them to the test. And World War II might be what a lot of the marketing talks about with this gun. But with only 1,400 made then, no, it wasn't really. It was a drop in the ocean there. It was Vietnam. And of course, the Vietnam conflict, Southeast Asia in general, started off slow, 61, 62. You know, you have things like Project Agile, where the earliest M16s were sent over. Well, in 1962, the U.S. government placed an order with Ithaca for some new shotguns, 12 gauge, 20-inch, pretty unadorned sling swivels. No heat shield, no bayonet lug though, just, you know, kind of a riot style gun. And there would be about 22,000 of these. Serials are around 50,000 up to about 72,000. But they would not have U.S. property marks, anything like that on them, because they were ordered specifically for the government in Saigon, South Vietnam. And Ithaca would deliver these between November and the end of January, between 62 and early 63. After that success, and as older Winchesters and whatnot wore out from World War II and use in Korea, the U.S. government, really the Army, also purchasing for other branches, would place its first order that would have U.S. property. It would have the P-proof and all the inspector stamps. And they would order around 23,000. And these would be the first with the S prefix serials. Now, they would be very similar to the previous Vietnamese contract, except no sling swivels for some reason. Still no heat shield, no bayonet lug. I'm not sure what the deal was. And by this point, these would all be phosphated guns. And so Ithaca would deliver these, and then towards the end of 63, the U.S. Air Force itself, kind of doing its own thing, would order the first true M37 trench guns to be built since World War II. Like this. They would have the heat shield. They would still take the old 1917 bayonet. The reason they use that bayonet goes all the way back to World War I and the Winchester 97, and how Winchester was making the P14 in later 1917. And so that was the bayonet they had on system, and that's why the system got set up. By the way, you can tell some heat shrouds have 6 holes, some have 4. There's differences between different productions, not to bore you. But yeah, that's why that bayonet, in fact, the bayonet was so kind of out of date that they had to make some new ones for the Vietnam conflict. But the Air Force order itself was not huge, just over 200 pieces. But it would not be the last. The Ithaca M37 would be one of the 2 primary shotguns used in Vietnam, at least early on, with the Stevens 77E, the other one. But the E, while it was alright, was kind of always reported to have issues. It was the M37 that was the favored son. And I would play some CCR if we weren't on YouTube. A heat shield bayonet system. Springfield used to make these for various trench guns. This is actually made by Inland, but it replicates the Vietnam style with the small holes. It mounts a 1917 style bayonet. If I wasn't out of the cabin, I'd click mine on for you, but I am. I don't happen to have it with me. I know, shocker. It also, of course, has the military style front swivel here, and then it has a 4+1 capacity tube. And since it is a 37, and it just has the one arm on the pump, as you see. Of course, most modern guns would have 2. Good old corncob style. Of course, it is the 37 style bottom feed, bottom ejection with this fork. It works well, and it's really good for being ambidextrous. And it is an alloy receiver, but it is a little bit more finicky than, say, a Mossberg, and definitely more than, say, a Remington 870. And it's a little more prone to maybe short shucking. In fact, take a look. Good times. That's a fun thing. Goes to show you, pump shotguns, guys, never fail, right?
Yep.
Also, I really wish I brought out that bayonet. You have kind of a nice phosphate finish, or replica style, and then hand-oiled stock, not a lot of adornment. Notice it doesn't have the fish and game type on the side. And then we have just a classic style, hard butt plate, and then a standard rear swivel, and they just use the standard web sling. So they really did do a good job. I like loading these. It's very easy to do, but the spring is obviously strong enough. The only downside I'd say to the 37 design, especially one like this, is disassembly. You can tell it's an older shotgun. If you check out older designs, they just don't come apart near as easy as shotguns we're accustomed to today, but that's okay. Not only would the Ithaca 37 service in Vietnam continue, there would be new orders. In May of 1966, the Navy would get involved. Its Naval Operations Special Group would order a few, I don't really know if we know, I think around 3,000 or so. Again, these would not have heat shields necessarily, but you know, they're kind of a take on the same pattern. And these would be dispersed to the Navy SEALs and whatnot. And then in 1967, the U.S. government, kind of again under the Army, would order more trench gun types. And unless something's changed, no one knows how many were in this order. Seems like the records for these, but it was not huge, but it wasn't tiny either. And these would be delivered through 67, maybe into 68. So the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, the Army all had some. Now, shotguns are a pretty specialized item. You don't need a ton. I mean, we're talking about a war, but they only had a few thousand XM177 carbines. What they would use them for in like naval situations, especially in like the Brownwater Navy, the man on point would have it. Sometimes they would use them to shoot mines in the water and just, other debris on land. They were also used to shoot landmines if they were detected. And guard duty, prisoner guard, just nighttime guard. A lot of little uses here and there popped up for these. And of course, a shotgun is not exactly not intimidating, especially with the long old bayonet. Like I said, they had to make new 1917 patterns. I believe General Cutlerly and Canada made these. They have black grips. The reputation isn't as nicely made, but they got the job done. It's just funny that a bayonet that was 50 years old was still being made in 1967. But, all good things do come to an end. This saw quite a bit of service, as I said earlier. It had a better reputation than the Stevens 77E, and a lot of the older good Winchesters were wearing out, so it stays remembered. About the serial number and the way they did this. This is the same prefix, the S, and the styling as what Ithaca made for the U.S. military and police departments, and they just kind of continued on the same serial range. I thought I lied to you when I said 4+1, but it is that you can almost get a fifth shell in the tube, but it goes almost past the plastic part of the casing, but then stops there. So yeah, it is 4+1. All right, Travis. In the late 60s, a new generation of 12-gauge shotgun was coming on the scene. Yes, the Mossberg 500 was just kind of coming around, especially once it got dual action bars, but the Remington 870 was coming into its own by this point. Also, Winchester would have the model 1200. So, beginning in the late 60s, early 70s, these would be what the government would order going forward. Remingtons, Winchesters, and eventually more and more Mossenbergs. So 67 was really the last contract from the U.S. government for these. However, I think it would continue to produce them even in the S serial range. Others were not produced in the range. Some of them were in the 900,000s, depending on the contract. But they would be offered and shipped to various police departments throughout the early and mid 1970s. So you can still find this style with the heat shield or handguard, and even bayonet mount and sling swivels and kind of the phosphate parkerized finish, old stock, but they may not have U.S. ordnance marks on them because they went to a police department. Or you can find some that were originally U.S. property but then sold off to police departments. Nevertheless, as you can tell, actual heat shielded versions are pretty uncommon, and the few hundreds or thousands that went over to Vietnam got used up, and probably a lot of them got left behind to Vietnamese allies as that war came to an end and U.S. troops pulled out. So the point is, in America today, originals are extremely hard to find, especially U.S. property, all authentic. And as I mentioned earlier, not all the contracts, in fact, the majority did not have the heat shields. Even if you find an Ithaca 37 that's old and has U.S. property and it has a heat shield, double check that it originally did, because I've seen some where someone slapped a reproduction heat shield on an original. You can usually tell them because a lot of the ones they did it with had the 18-inch, not the 20-inch barrel, and so it'll fit, but the barrel doesn't stick out a half-inch or so like on this one. In fact, it's recessed down in. Just a little pointer, but there's a lot of guides and things. Know your markings, what was when used where, and different things. Or you could just buy a reproduction like I did, cord, and not worry about it, and when you can get out and shoot, because they are a lot of fun. It's a very smooth action, and one I really enjoy. Another story to tell. The original M37s, you could slam fire. Hold the trigger, take safety off. Safety does work. And notice the trigger is dead. It still works the same here, but now there's a new safety feature on the newer ones where you can't slam fire. It'll just retard the hammer enough that it won't work. So you have to let off the trigger. And this is the case with all modern, like Remingtons, Mossbergs, but the originals you could just fire your 5 rounds as fast as you could pump. I know someone might say, oh, that's just modern government lawyer talk, whatever. I understand what you're coming from. The thing is, years ago, I was buying guns off a gentleman, a friend of mine, honestly, who lived out of state. He was getting out an old Winchester 1897, and he was trying to unload it in his closet. And because of the whole slam fire trigger situation, he was just trying to go quick. He shot inside, and so I was with a friend, and we heard him go in the room, and then heard a boom, and we were stunned. I mean, 12 gauge going off in the house. It was terrifying, and we were both basically saying, okay, who's going to go in there and look and see if there was an accident? And he walked out of his gun closet and said, "Don't tell me you've never done that before." And we both just looked at him and said, No, in all honesty, we're glad you're okay, but no, neither of us have ever done that before. So I can understand where the change needed to be taken, especially since new modern guns don't work that way. So someone accustomed to an 870, a Mossberg, or whatever, if they got a hold of one of these that still did the slam fire trick, yeah, it's a change. It's one of those few safety changes that I'm in favor of, and I could have lost a friend over an old Winchester not having it. Luckily I didn't, and luckily he at least had his gun pointed in a semi-safe direction. It actually hit a steel ammo can filled with old flags, so it stopped it. But that could have been a very, very, very different day. So thankful it didn't happen. Guys, be safe with firearms. The M37 would kind of knock about inventory rooms and whatnot through the 70s and 80s, seeing less and less use. Still might have been a handful around for the first Gulf War. But even then, like the Winchester 1200 and the first generation Remington 870s were getting long in the tooth. But even today, the pump shotgun serves, and the modern Mossbergs and Remingtons really aren't a sight different than this. I'd say the biggest difference, the newer guns can all fire 3-inch Magnum, although 2 3/4 12 gauge double aught buck is still the standard. And I do like that the newer production ones from Inland-Ithaca can fire 3-inch in addition to 2 3/4. Even if I don't ever plan on shooting 3-inch, it's nice to know that it's strong enough. So yeah, appreciate you hanging out here. I've just always found trench guns in general interesting, but unfortunately originals, the Winchester 97 and the 12, even an original 37, I don't know how much I'd want to put a lot of work through them. They're getting old and valuable. So when there's a good quality repro like this or reissue, I like it. Now there were of course those Winchester 97s that were made in China that Inner Arms brought in, or Inner Ordnance Group, I forget which one now. The folks up in Massachusetts, those were really interesting. Some of them were good, some of them were the opposite of good. Just kind of Chinese quality. I wish more companies would do military-style shotguns. Mossberg does a good one, the 590A1. And good piece of American history and something very unique to American firearms. America's really the one that deployed shotguns in any numbers in both world wars, Korea, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. So to me, it's a iconic part of our history and, you know, something worth preserving. And I really do like the newer made Ithacers. I think they've done a pretty darn good job. But what do you think? Do you own one? Either a trench gun or any of the other types? Let me know in the talk below. Again, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Like to help support us. Check out the link on Patreon. Check out some of our older videos that go more in depth on the history. And let me know how you like this format out here at the cabin and over on the porch. Kind of workshopping in a bit, but yeah, feedback is always appreciated. This is Misha, and we'll catch you very soon next time.